You are listening to Words with a Mad Coach. I am Mad Coach. I am Mad Coach. I am Mad Coach. Coach Sess. Coach Sess. I am Mad Coach. I am Mad Coach. I am Mad Coach. Coach Sess. Coach Sess. I am Mad Coach. I am Mad Coach. I am Mad Coach. Coach Sess. Coach Sess. I am Mad Coach. I am Mad Coach. I am Mad Coach. Coach Sess. Coach Sess. You are listening to Words with a Mad Coach.
It's a mad world out there, and if you're going to navigate it, you're going to need somebody who's just a little bit mad himself. And that's me, Coach Sess. I'm here to guide you. Today, I want to talk about the growth of MMA in North Carolina. I want to talk about the differences of the eras that we've gone through. I think there have been 3 very distinct eras. The one that I want to discuss the most is the Sanctioned era, which started in 2008. But to understand the contrast, we have to look back to the 90s, the late 90s, when there was more underground fights, definitely not sanctioned at all. And the difference between an underground fight and a non-sanctioned fight is that in the underground, it may be just one fight on the card. It may just be a bunch of guys meeting up to do it in their backyard or in some type of a garage. And these fights did happen, ladies and gentlemen. A lot of people don't know about them, but they did happen. Even some of your UFC stars have fought in these fights in their states. I know guys who come from Chicago area who've actually done some of these underground fights here in North Carolina. Then you have the non-sanctioned fights, and this is organization. So they have organization, and pretty much on the card, they either have some type of boxing structure, kickboxing structure, or grappling or MMA. So they were a little bit more diverse in the way they approached things at the time. But they did have, in some cases, they had their own sanctioning people. You know, they would have some made up organization to sanction it, but it wouldn't be anything legit. They would have a medical person on hand to do some type of physical. Back then, in a lot of the non-sanctioned days, there was no exchange of money for licenses or for signups. One of the common techniques that I used to see, because fighters were hesitant about showing up to the event, they would make you put down a deposit and you had to show up to get it back. In the sanctioning era, this is where we get more legal. Fees were associated, medicals were associated. Here in North Carolina, we had state legislation. Things had to be voted into common practice. So we just couldn't set up a show. A lot of the guys before the sanctioning days, they went in and out of different states, or they had underground fights throughout the state that nobody knew about. So if you think about the underground fights, this is more of your movie, The Fight Club. You know, it's very select people that know about it. You got to be in that in crowd to really know the goings-ons and where to find it. And then the non-sanctioning, here's the thing. They had a lot of non-sanctioned shows that went from state to state, you know, because again, the laws were somewhat vague and very weak. And so there were shows, you know, that could put on, 10, 15 shows in a year, traveling from state to state. The problem with some of the non-sanctioned fights is basically they didn't really open it up to everybody. You know, it was kind of like they were just only trying to showcase 1 or 2 fighters, build up their resume and try to get them off into the big shows or whatever. When we get to the sanctioned era, for North Carolina, that really started around about 2008. And the first sanctioned show anyway, that went down in that year was a show called Mayhem in the Cage. And it was put on by George Hines, who was also probably the most prominent name in the Tough Man contest. And in that year, North Carolina had about 67 events. Mayhem in the Cage, the MMA event, was about, they had 9 events. And half of those 67 events were MMA of some type. There were other organizations involved, but half of them were MMA. So out of about 33 events scheduled for that year, George Hines was responsible for about 9 of them. And the cool part about it is that, every fighter and coach has got to get a start from somewhere. So on those cards, I saw names like Chris Clodfelter, the head instructor for 8 Points Muay Thai. His, number one guy, in my opinion, Mike Stevens, also fought for Mayhem in the Cage. Josh Murdoch, very well-known black belt and jiu-jitsu instructor in the area. Joey Carroll, the brother of Roger Carroll. So Superior Martial Arts was definitely in the house in 2008. Trying to think some other names. Alan Greenway, Ryan Hayes. My buddy and friend, excellent coach, now is located in Maryland, but Mike Pagano, currently with Royal Martial Arts. Mike Pagano got his start with Mayhem in the Cage in Havelock, North Carolina. They showcased Keith Rockstar Richardson, who will be returning to the cage August 24th at Fight Lab 61 in Charlotte, North Carolina.
It's time to handle our business! Oh, we number one up in here! Oh, we the best of the best of the best of the best! Don't never let nobody tell you different! Failure is not an option! We gon' show them that we the best that ever was! It's time to handle our business! Oh, we number one up in here!
So there was a lot of good coaches that got their start here. I don't remember seeing any prominent names that would have made it to the UFC, but I did see other names associated with other shows, other events. Guys like Owen St. Preux, Rodney Wallace, Derek Brunson, guys who started that first year, and they did make it to the UFC eventually. And oddly enough, in a very short period of time, I wonder what happened to that cycle, that sequence where you could just be a good fighter and make it to the UFC. Now it's all these hoops you have to jump through. Seems like they've made it a lot harder. Should have been a lot easier because winning fights should be the number one priority. The Mayhem in the Cage put on 9 events that year, and when I look at the different eras, one thing that I notice is that in the days of the non-sanctioned fights, just about all of the fights would end by some kind of weird result, whether it be a KO, submission. And when I say weird in that capacity, the KO could be guy getting his legs kicked out just because he didn't know how to take leg kicks, or guy getting knocked out because he got his arm or leg entangled in the ropes and wouldn't let go. A lot of these guys fought based upon their martial arts. So if their martial arts said you should kick, that's what you kind of did. You stayed at kicking range. If you should punch, it didn't matter what tools were in the art. They just kind of catered to the art. Then in the non-sanctioned era, you saw style versus style. But the thing now is that guys were actually good at their style. So you actually saw good wrestling. You actually saw good boxing, good jiu-jitsu. And a lot of those fights, those early fights, were done inside of a ring. So there was the visibility in some cases. I've heard people say this in the past. The visibility was better. People could observe the fights and they enjoyed them a lot better. Some of these fights were not recorded properly in terms of documentation. They would get your name wrong, spell your name wrong. And so sometimes when you go check your records later on, you might find out that you had a few less fights or a few more fights. And it doesn't affect a lot of the guys now, because a lot of the guys who fought then would have been so young that now they either don't fight or they're coaching now. So it doesn't really affect them anymore. But some of that still happens. They still get records wrong because, remember, it's still controlled by people. But in the sanctioned era, one of the things we started noticing was that people were now starting to use the cage more when the cage became the iconic symbol in terms of MMA. And that's what people had to use. I started noticing that people would use the cage a little bit more. They still didn't have a lot of skill that they do now, 10 years, 11 years later, but they were trying to use the cage. You didn't see the classic wrestler shot that you saw in the non-sanctioned era. Now you're seeing people push people up against the cage, try to take them down. So wrestling seemed to be across the board because there were so many shows. Wrestling kind of stood out as being that last martial art, that last holdout. So people really weren't good at it. When in the non-sanctioned area, when you saw a good wrestler, you did see one or two. You didn't see it across the board. But it stood out because they were really good at it, because they really know how to shoot singles and doubles, in the ring. And 9 times out of 10, it was the wrestler versus the striker type mentality. So that's what made the techniques from both guys look very good. You didn't have to worry about the other guy throwing the techniques back at you. And with the sanctioned era, you saw more strategy in terms of how to use the enclosure, very consistent with the growth of the UFC. Just like Tito Ortiz came up, started putting guys against the cage and pounding them out there or slamming them out in some cases. Just as we saw Mark Coleman come up with the ground and pound. You see these evolutions based upon the enclosure, based upon the cage. When Anthony Pettis jumped off the cage and kicked Ben Henderson in the head. You see these evolutions based upon the cage. So that was the sanctioned era, and North Carolina's kind of grown and kept up with the times. It's going to come a time when there's going to be a greater evolution. But enjoy these videos. These were fun, and this last one right here is just a gem. I'm not even going to talk over it. I want you to listen to it for yourself.